Thank you, Brooke, and thank you very much for the lovely opportunity to join you this afternoon and tell you a story about science communication and to share some lessons that we have learned over the last 15 years in watching the scientific community, the natural science community, communicate with the public about its findings and about our future as a planet. And in the process, I'm going to hope to illustrate for you how social science can be useful in illustrating the ways that intuition about communication may sometimes lead us awry and how social science can help us improve what we do in these communications. So all of the evidence I'm going to tell you about today comes from a scientific method involving national surveys, where we have been interviewing people across the country between 1997 and 2012, our most recent survey evidence coming out very recently. These are all surveys of random samples of American adults we call landlines and cell phones. People are interviewed either by telephone or, in a few cases, over the internet, although I'm going to focus on telephone surveys today. These studies all involve extensive interviewer training and supervision. I agonize about wording questions in balanced ways. We'll talk a little bit about that briefly. And importantly, these surveys are never described to people at the outset as being about climate change. So they're not set up in order to allow people to select in if they're interested in the topic and to select out if they are not. How do flies get in a room like this, one wonders? And why the speaker of all possible people? So during today's talk, given the assumption that the fly does not distract me so long that I lose time, that we'll begin with some speculations that have been shared by experts in this arena about what the public thinks about climate change and has thought for some time. And then I'll give you a quick tour of the evidence, giving you a feel for what I believe the public actually has believed over time. And we'll talk in particular in some depth about the notion of scientific integrity, because you know that in many ways the integrity of the scientific enterprise has been called into question aggressively and remains called into question today in this arena. So there are some important and valuable lessons to be learned about that by understanding how it happened. In particular, we'll look at evidence on ClimateGate and on reports of potential errors in IPCC reports. We will shift gears and talk about trust in scientists as a potential moderator of the communication process, not necessarily the idea illustrated here that events may cause trust in scientists to decline, but rather that you can think of the public as divided into two groups, those who trust scientists and those who don't, and that when you separate those two groups and track changes in opinion over time, you learn important lessons about the role that trust plays in the communication process. We'll talk as well about perceptions of agreement among scientists in this arena and how those have changed. And eventually we're going to talk, if we have time, about our newest research where natural scientists, you might say, cross the line from describing simply natural science findings to making policy prescriptions for government about what to do with those findings. Okay, so to begin, part one, a few speculations. The Boston Globe said some years ago, the ignorance of the American public about global warming stands as an indictment of the US media. Or in Science, in October 2008, John Sterman said, the strong scientific consensus on the causes and risks of climate change stands in stark contrast to widespread confusion and complacency among the public. In November 2010, said Bloomberg Businessweek, the number of Americans who agree the Earth is warming because of man-made activity has been in free fall. Or, in February 2011, why don't Americans believe in global warming? Asked The Economist. And most recently, in 2012, the public has caught on and believes the global warming issue is dead, said Senator James Inhofe. So there's agreement among these speculators, although some of them take more joy in their observations than others. Is it all true? Are these characterizations in prominent publications accurately portraying what the American public believes and has believed over time? Well, we'll begin by looking at the fundamentals. Has warming been happening? Has it been caused by humans? And is it a threat? So first, let me show you one of the survey questions we've asked in our surveys over a long period of time. This one says, you may have heard about the idea that the world's temperature may have been going up slowly over the past 100 years. What's your personal opinion on this? Do you think this has probably been happening, or do you think it probably has not been happening? And here are the results we've seen over this time period. So starting in 1997, 79% of Americans said they thought it probably had been happening. And in our most recent survey in 2012, just a couple of months ago, that number is nearly identical at 77%. You can see a rise here in this mid-period. These are 3 different surveys, all done in 2007, producing nearly identical numbers, tied with 2006 as well. You see a small drop here, an increase, and a drop. Now, you might look at this and say it's a contradiction of the claim from skeptics that if you do the same survey twice with Americans, you'll get completely different results. No, actually, if you do a series of surveys with Americans over time asking the same question, you get nearly identical results. You might think that these ups and downs are evidence of measurement error, and certainly there is measurement error and sampling error in surveys. But I'll show you shortly that this is not error. We can explain the downs and we can explain the ups. Second question. If the Earth has been warming gradually over the last 100 years, do you think this has been caused mostly by things people have done, mostly by natural processes, or about equally by things people have done and natural processes? And the percent of Americans, when we first asked this question in 2006, who pointed the finger at human activity was fully 80%. That number is at 70% in our most recent survey. Now, you're getting a feel for some big percentages. And it's important to bear in mind, these are really remarkable in the arena of American public opinion research. As you know, Americans are divided about equally on so many issues, but not on this one. Here's another graph combining together the 2 that I've shown you so far. So this is the percent of people who say the Earth has been warming gradually and who say that warming is caused by humans. So these numbers are lower than either of the prior 2 graphs, and you can see they travel from 70% in 2006 to 63% today. A little bit more typical of the kinds of majorities that we sometimes see. When we ask people if the Earth's temperature were to increase 5 degrees over the next 75 years, overall would this be good, bad, or neither good nor bad? When we first asked this in 1997, 60% of Americans said they thought it would be bad. Most recently, when we asked it in 2010, that number was 56%. So these numbers have stayed relatively flat. Now, before we go on, maybe you feel good about this. Maybe you should feel good about this if you're concerned about the possibility that Americans have not heard natural scientists and have been skeptical in thinking about what natural scientists have to say. Now, it's certainly true that different surveys done by different organizations have produced different numbers. And here's a graph of a variety of different results. Our numbers are right in here. That's this little line here that I've shown you. This is the percent of people who say they think the Earth has been warming over the last 100 years. Depending upon how you ask the questions, you can get lower numbers, or higher numbers, in fact. And you might notice here that the top line here comes from Gallup surveys, and the bottom line comes from Gallup surveys. So it depends on how you ask the question what number you get. But you can certainly see here this same downward trend that I've shown you in our numbers in a number of different survey organizations. I'm going to, first of all, cover up the right-hand side, and you can see up from 2006 through 2007, there actually is no evidence from the diamonds over there of any decline. All the decline happened between 2008 and 2010. So why this decline? Can we point the finger of blame at the scientific community somehow? Well, there are a series of hypotheses one can investigate, and one is the declining trust in scientists, perhaps due to ClimateGate and the purported errors in IPCC reports. Secondly, though, you can easily imagine the claim that this turning away from the problem is due to the economic meltdown that the country experienced in late 2008. After all, it's in 2008 and 2009 that we see the lower numbers. Perhaps Americans say, we're in economic crisis, we cannot afford expensive solutions to a climate problem, and in order to feel good about not doing them, I guess I'd rather deny the existence of the problem in the first place. Third possibility. Maybe it's news media agenda setting. Is it possible that the volume of news coverage devoted to this issue is responsible for that decline? A hypothesis I'll explain a bit more in a moment. And there is also Anthony Downs' issue attention cycle, in which he asserted that after 2007, when the country paid a great deal of attention to the issue, as you know, legislators in Congress did not succeed in passing aggressive legislation to reduce emissions. When legislators send the signal that we can live without passing legislation, Downs proposed many years ago, perhaps Americans get the signal that the problem's not that serious after all. So I want to begin by showing you some evidence on each of these, starting with ClimateGate, which you know occurred in late 2009. There was news media coverage of the hacking of emails of climate scientists at the University of East Anglia. And in our surveys, we have investigated the possibility that this had impact, first by asking this question about 6 months later. During the last 6 months, do you remember hearing or reading anything in the news about emails that were sent by scientists who study the world's climate, or do you not remember hearing or reading anything in the news about that? Now, of course, if I asked you all this question, you would say yes. The question is, how many Americans would agree with you on that? And of the people who said they remembered something, we asked them, what do you remember hearing or reading? And here's what we found. First of all, the percent of Americans who said they thought they remembered hearing or reading something about it was 32%. They haven't said what they remembered yet. They just say, yeah, I think I remember hearing something about that. So this is not the case that the American public was obsessed with this issue and 6 months later they were walking around talking about it. But more importantly, when we looked at the follow-ups to it, fully 71% of people now, an additional group of people said they didn't actually, yes, I heard something, but I didn't remember. And what we see here is a series of a few explanations that line up with what we might imagine. Emails were hacked, research was inaccurate, there was scientific misconduct. And when we put these numbers together into the people who said any one of these, it's only 13% of the country who gave what I'll argue is a reasonable answer to suggest some basis for growing skepticism. Other people said, well, there's disagreement among scientists, or there were misinterpretations by the media, or there were emails about polar bears or the Arctic Circle. So this is not huge numbers of people expressing views that this event caused skepticism in their thinking. But more importantly, when we ask them directly, do you think these emails indicate to you that scientists who study the world's climate should be trusted, indicate that these scientists should not be trusted, or do they not indicate anything about trust? What we see is only 9% of people said they thought the emails indicated that scientists shouldn't be trusted. Now, it's possible that all of those people changed their opinions, that before they heard this news, they trusted scientists, and after they heard it, they didn't. But another possibility is that these were people who started off not trusting the scientists in the first place, and that there would be no impact, and we'll look at that in a moment. But before we do, let me show you a similar analysis of the IPCC report errors. Here, 24% of people said they thought they remembered hearing something about errors in these reports. And when we asked them, what did the news say? Well, 8% said they thought there were mistakes in the reports. 4% said something about scientific misconduct. 4% saying something about disagreement among scientists. And these answers were not on target. So these are very small percentages of people who walked away with a basis for skepticism. And when we asked directly, 13% said they thought that those reports suggested to them that the scientists shouldn't be trusted. So I've told you these two interpretations already, that either they caused a trust in scientists to drop, or those percentages were people who didn't trust scientists anyway. Fortunately, we can test these hypotheses directly because we have data. Over time, we ask people, how much do you trust the things that scientists studying the environment say? And what I've done here is to show you the percentages of people who selected one of the top 3 points on the rating scale, but you get the same result regardless of how you cut it. In 2006, 72% placed themselves in one of these top 3 categories. In 2007, 75%. In 2008, 68%. And in a survey done just after the IPCC news coverage exploded, this percentage was 70%. And in a survey 6 months later, this percentage was 71%. And as of 2010, it's still at 71%. To me, these data say there is no crisis of confidence in science as a result of this event. So as much as our intuitions might tell us otherwise, this is a case where this possibility does not seem to explain the decline in public beliefs about climate change's existence. So what alternative explanations are plausible? Well, there is the economic meltdown. We can't afford to fix it, so maybe it's not a problem in the first place. We've looked and looked for evidence to support this claim, and we have yet to find it. There's no evidence that people's assessments of the magnitude of the breakdown have caused it, and as I'll show you in a moment, there are alternative explanations. Here's one little piece of the evidence. This is the percent of Americans expressing support for government action in either of these two ways to reduce future emissions in these four ways. And across this time period, from 2006 to 2010, you can see a very small decline from just above 80% to just below 80% in the percent of Americans who favored government efforts to reduce emissions in these ways. If people felt that these kinds of steps would be costly and therefore raise questions about whether they should even believe in climate change, we would see a steep decline in these graphs, which we do not see. Next, the agenda setting hypothesis comes from McCombs and Shaw in 1972. What they proposed is, if the news media focus their attention on a problem, Americans also focus their attention on that problem. People think about what they're led to think about. And in fact, in the climate change arena, you can see this is the percent of US print newspaper articles on global warming or climate change during this time period. And you can see a huge surge. In 2007, if you remember, you could not turn a corner in America without bumping into some news coverage of climate change someplace. This is a huge increase from about 20,000 stories up to about 40,000 stories. As a result of that, would say this hypothesis, Americans' concerns should have risen dramatically in 2008. Didn't happen. So that doesn't look right. Furthermore, the agenda setting hypothesis is really about problem importance. What McCombs and Shaw said is, if the media focus on a problem, it will increase Americans' perceptions of the importance of the problem, but not necessarily anything about the existence of the problem. So that turns out not to work so well at all. So now I'd like to turn to the explanation that I'll put on the table as one that I think has survived our testing quite well. And it begins with this differentiation between people who trust scientists and people who do not. And I want to propose that the folks who trust scientists accept what they say. It's actually not a big fight. There are people, however, who do not trust what scientists say, and they've got to make their decisions on some basis other than the findings that come out of this building and those of us who support this building. So for these people, I'll propose one alternative for them is to look at world temperature changes. And here's an example of what's been happening to world temperature, in case you haven't been paying attention, that in recent years, since 2000, there is, of course, an upward trend. 2010 was the warmest year on record in history, but you can see a few points here where Earth's temperature was relatively low. Now, you know, if you pay attention to what natural science experts say, that there's nothing diagnostic in the last 10 years of temperature about whether the last 100 years of temperature have been showing an increase or not. Although, of course, you know, there was plenty of news coverage in 2010 of the fact that it was the warmest year on record, potentially pointing to that as a piece of evidence in support of the claim of climate change. So here's one illustration, I think, of the way low-trust people may think. This comes from the Huffington Post. The world today is warmer than, sorry, I should say when I was a kid, but it's definitely not warmer than 10 years ago in my country, and the stats say this is true on a worldwide basis. So this is an example of a blog poster responding to a news article, expressing skepticism by focusing on recent world temperature. And we, in fact, have evidence that this is exactly how the low-trust folks think. So in our surveys, when we ask people, do you think recent world temperatures have been higher than they were in the years previously? Notice here, this is 2008 when a big drop happened. And in fact, among people who are highly trusting of scientists, they were aware of this. Fewer people in 2009 said recent world temperatures had been higher than said so in the earlier years. But there's a much more pronounced drop among low trust in scientists individuals. That is, these people pay close attention, and they knew that world temperature in 2008 was lower than it had been before. And as it turns out, it's that perception that drives change. Here are the high trust people. When we ask them, do you think climate change has been happening? You can see a very small decline in their numbers, but this is the low trust people. All of the decline over this time period in existence claims comes from these low trust people in this year following their perception that the Earth's temperature had in fact been cooler. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I just want you to see here, this is all these asterisks here. This is a highly significant regression coefficient among people who do not trust scientists. This is not a significant regression coefficient among people who do trust scientists. What that tells you is the ups and downs over the entire time period that we've been making these measurements in existence beliefs can be explained by world temperature changes among the low trust people and are not explained at all by world temperature changes among the high trust people. In fact, buried in here, what this says is a 1/10 of a degree Celsius increase in the previous year's average temperature predicts a 9.7 percentage point increase in the percentage of that group who believe that climate change has been happening. Now, there is one other potential explanation here that you can also see some support initially for in the data. And this is the perception of agreement among scientists. We asked people, do you think most scientists agree about whether the Earth's temperature has been gradually warming, or do you think there's a lot of disagreement? And if you look in this time period, following 2008, there is in fact a drop in the percentage of people who thought there's a lot of agreement among scientists. Now, you might be distressed at first to look at those numbers if you believe that a large majority of natural science experts agree on this issue. But it's important for you to know that the way this question is framed, when we ask, do you think most scientists agree? You might think, as I used to, that most means more than half, but not so for Americans. Americans interpret the word most to mean more than 80%. And so, in fact, when we asked in a subsequent survey, what percent of climate scientists do you believe think that climate change has been happening? This is the distribution of percentages, and fully 80% of Americans think at least half or more of climate scientists agree on this issue. Now, you might say, well, the right answer is way over here. That 90%, 95% of climate scientists believe that climate change has been happening. But I would suggest to you, I've seen some indirect evidence, but no high-quality survey yet that defines a population of natural scientists and asks them for this belief in a way that allows a calculation of that number. So we're guessing about what percent of people in the scientific community believe it. If you add these two numbers together, 15 and 16, it's about 30, above 80. So that number that I showed you earlier coincides here. Now, you might notice this bulge at 50. In fact, Wendy's research has been important in highlighting that we shouldn't stop here at this 50%, because some of the people, perhaps many of the people who say 50, are actually saying, I don't know. They're not saying it's 50%, half of them. So we followed up everybody who answered this question with 50 by asking them, are you saying this because you don't know, or are you saying this because you believe 1 out of every 2 climate scientists think climate change has been happening? This 20 is the percent of people who pick that latter option, who remain after we pull out the don't knows. So this set of percentages, I think, suggests there is actually not such bad news here in terms of Americans' perceptions of scientific consensus. Given the time, I'm going to skip over lots of slides here, and I apologize for this. But while we're skipping, I'll tell you the story. What we looked at was... Sorry. Time flies when you're having fun. Okay, I have one last story to tell you. Right here. Come on. Okay, we're going to end with crossing the line. So, you know that natural scientists often are in the spotlight talking about natural science, but sometimes they also offer policy prescriptions. Could you imagine that this is maybe not a good step? Is it possible that members of the public are willing to trust a scientist if he or she talks about arenas in which he or she truly has expertise? But if that natural scientist walks off into the policy arena, you can certainly imagine that policymakers might suddenly say, wait a second, he's now telling me what laws to pass? I know more about this than he does. And if he's willing to offer opinions about this, maybe I can't trust the natural science opinions he's expressed either. And is it possible that that line of reasoning actually plays out in the general public as well? So we did a national survey in which respondents were randomly assigned to watch a videotaped interview of a natural scientist, either simply talking about the natural science findings of climate change or also talking about policy prescriptions to follow from it. When people reported their own opinions after that, we found this surprising result that I will show you in 20 seconds. That is, on the right-hand side, each of these bars is shorter than the bars on the left-hand side. When the natural scientist talked about policy, he reduced trust in what he said, perceptions of the accuracy of his statements, the percent of scientists who the respondent said he or she trusted, the amount of government action that he or she thought should be taken on the issue, endorsement of 10 different policies designed to reduce future emissions, even belief in the existence of climate change as a problem, and belief that it was caused by humans. So I want to caution you with the following words of general conclusions. First, intuition is great. All research begins with intuition. But before you allow your intuition to guide your insights into the way the American public thinks and what will influence them, survey measurement and other social science research is crucial and valuable, because in this case I hope that you feel walking away from this talk a good feeling about many aspects of science communication. The public is very much on the side of natural scientists on this issue, and as you can see, natural scientists focusing on their bread and butter push points of view with the public effectively, whereas straying outside of those boundaries brings with it some risk. Thank you very much.